Hey guys, this is Danger with Today in DeFi. Today we're going to go over the ecosystem update for April 14th. This is where we look at the on-chain metrics of major blockchains. In my opinion, this is one of the most important things you can do as a trader. It's to look at the on-chain data and see where it diverges from price or CT narratives and using that to trade to your advantage. So yeah, let's get into it. And just a quick reminder, we have a YouTube channel now, and we're putting out videos every week on ecosystem updates, but also DeFi news, and we're even doing interviews with DeFi protocols like this FX protocol interview. So check it out, YouTube at Today DeFi. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to start off with stablecoins. So this is going to look at the general flows to the ecosystem. And this is one of the few weeks where we've actually had some slowdown in the stablecoin flows. So a slight decrease in the flows, but nothing too serious. It's still a little bit interesting because I think this is kind of a sentiment bottom because we've been basically up only on stablecoins even when the market was going down because stablecoins, they don't really drop in value and there's a lot of farming opportunities on chain. Okay, so let's look at the actual chains and what's going on. Starting off, yeah, so 7-day change, the leaders in the majors are Solana and then yeah, BSC, which is interesting. And then Arbitrum's not too bad, and Avalanche is really outperforming, which is kind of surprising. And yeah, finally Tron. This is a stablecoin chain, so not that surprising, but yeah, pretty good numbers. We can also see that on the stablecoin numbers. So Tron once again, also Solana a little bit lower because this is just the stablecoins, and I would say that Solana has less stablecoin farming ops. And then Arbitrum actually has pretty good numbers as well, and Hyperliquid really outperforming. Let's look at the actual activity on these chains on Artemis. First, we're going to look at the major chains. I'm comparing Ethereum, Solana, and BNB. And on CT, you're not going to hear much about BNB, but people actually use BNB. I think it's kind of like underestimated, especially on CT. And these numbers are lower than, Solana, for instance, but actually they're quite high. You can see they're much higher than Ethereum, partly because BNB is super cheap, but still, it means there's a lot of users on BNB. Like, it's not just bots and stuff. Yeah, so yeah, and then in terms of stablecoin supply and of course TVL, like Ethereum is still the, like the 900-pound gorilla here. But in terms of the actual activity on chain, it's not as clear. Like the DEX volumes are actually quite close between Ethereum and Solana. So Ethereum has done quite well recently, and I would say that yeah, recently it's actually quite good. Unfortunately, I would say this is partly because of the downtrend. Probably a lot of liquidations and stuff going on here, but still like relatively neck and neck volume performance on these spot dexes. And then similarly on the fees, you can see these are being generated because of that volume and yeah, pretty close. But yeah, a little bit more pulling ahead here by Ethereum because Ethereum a little bit more expensive to use. In terms of fees and revenue, it's a good thing. Yeah, and just to emphasize how you shouldn't overlook BNB, we can look at the chart here. This is actually a relatively decent chart compared to some of the other coins out there, especially ETH and even Solana. Like BNB has been outperforming. So yeah, don't discount BNB just because you don't hear about it on CT. Okay, looking at L2s. Arbitrum base and optimism kind of putting on here just as a comparison. Base is clearly outperforming in terms of the active addresses. It's not really like much cheaper to use base than Arbitrum, I don't think. I think they're probably the same. Arbitrum might even be cheaper. I'll have to check. So this, like, even though active addresses aren't necessarily the most accurate metric for users, it's still like, I would say comparable between these chains because the costs are quite comparable. And yeah, you can see that on most of the metrics, base is doing quite well, but Arbitrum has actually been recovering recently and not doing too poorly. You can see the volume here has been like a really very comparable between base and Arbitrum. Yeah, but still some pulling ahead by base, and you can see that there's a really a big advantage here because base has this native integration with the Coinbase. Okay. And then once again, I'm going back to Solana and Ethereum, but here I'm adding Hyperliquid because Hyperliquid is really like doing crazy good. So in terms of like, I think you can't quite see the TVL on this chart for Hyperliquid. You can barely see the TVL for Hyperliquid here. But in terms of the actual volume, oh no, that's not the one to look at. In terms of like the fees and the revenue, like Hyperliquid is doing crazy good. And yeah, we'll look at that a little bit more. Like we can see it here. So yeah, on spot they're doing okay. They have like 100 million, but then on perps they have like $6 billion of volume. That's like comparable to centralized exchanges. So the reason I'm comparing Hyperliquid, which is like this, it's not really a full EVM chain, I would say at this point. Like you can build stuff on it, but there's just not a full suite of DeFi applications. But it's still pulling these crazy revenue figures. So the only chain that I can compare it to are like the biggest blockchains in the world. So that's, that's really saying something. And finally, I'm looking at some alt L1s. So these are a bunch of different chains. These generally all have low fees, so the active addresses are all going to be quite huge. Stablecoin supply is harder to fake, and this one is quite surprising. Avalanche still has a ton of stablecoin supply, and a lot of growth recently by Sui, even through like this bearish trend, which is really interesting. So the farming there is probably pretty good. TVL you can see is a bit more neck and neck. You can also see Sonic is doing quite good. And in terms of volume, it's also pretty competitive here, but Sui is actually pulling ahead. And also on fees, although fees, these are all low fee chains because they're, all alt L1s competing on speed and fees. So they're not super high, but Sui is pulling ahead a bit here too as well. You don't hear about Sui much, but I think it is a blockchain that might be worth paying attention to. And the other surprising dark knight here is Avalanche. Yeah. So that's mostly it for this week. I found it really interesting that there's a few surprises here, like Avalanche coming back is not on my bingo card for 2025. Sui is also kind of underlooked. I think it's actually, in terms of the token price, it's not doing great, but at least recently it's not doing that bad either. And then the other obvious one is Hyperliquid is really doing well. Yeah, so yeah, that's it for this week. I hope that helped you. I really think this kind of analysis is super useful for trading. So hopefully it's helpful for you and also is relevant for farming and even airdrops. Yeah, I hope you like that. Remember to like and subscribe and see you next week.